Her fingers closed around his sleeve before her mind had finished deciding. He turned slowly. That was the most terrifying part. Not a flinch, not a startled step backward. Just the slow, deliberate rotation of a man who had never once been surprised and intended to keep it that way. Ryu Seokmin looked down at her hand on his arm the way a king might look at a peasant who had wandered onto his throne. 41 years old, dark suit, eyes like the bottom of a well, deep, cold, and completely without light. "Dance with me." Jang Mi-Yeon kept her voice low, steady. Every instinct she had was screaming. His expression didn't change. "You're the entertainment." "Yes," she tightened her grip. "And right now, entertaining you means moving you. Now, please." Something shifted behind those eyes. Not fear. Men like Ryu Seokmin had surgically removed fear long ago. It was something closer to curiosity, the dangerous kind. "No one touches me," he said quietly, and walks away from it. "I know," she held his gaze. "Dance with me anyway." The ballroom of the Busan Grand Sejong glittered around them, a private gala so exclusive that the guest list itself was classified. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across a sea of tailored shoulders and diamond throats. Old money and new power, all of it humming with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been truly afraid. Mi-Yeon was supposed to be finishing her solo. Her Hanbok, deep jade and gold, the embroidery alone worth 3 months of her academy's rent, was still trembling from the final movement she had abandoned mid-breath when she saw it. The red dot. Faint, barely a whisper of light, pulsing in the curve of a crystal wine glass near the centerpiece, reflecting from somewhere above and behind the east balcony. She had spent 15 years training her eyes to catch the smallest detail, the angle of a wrist, the placement of a heel, the shift of weight before a turn. She had seen what no one else in the room was looking for, because no one else in the room was watching everything. She had perhaps 4 seconds before the man in the expensive suit ceased to exist. Seokmin's hand came to her waist, slowly, deliberately, like a man who had decided to be amused. They moved. The room stirred, confused murmurs rippling outward from the dance floor like a stone dropped in still water. Baek Dong-hyun, stationed 6 feet to Seokmin's left, had his hand inside his jacket before they'd taken the second step. Mi-Yeon could feel his eyes on the back of her neck like a blade. Seokmin leaned in slightly. "You have until this song ends," he said, his voice barely above breath, "to explain why you are still alive." "Watch the chair," she whispered back. "Seat 1, head table, watch it." He didn't look. His eyes stayed on her face, reading her the way she imagined he read everything, searching for the lie, the angle, the motive beneath the motive. They danced. The room watched. And 11 seconds later, the high-backed chair at seat 1, the chair where Ryu Seokmin's head had been resting 40 seconds before, cracked apart in an explosion of shredded upholstery and splintered mahogany as a high-caliber round tore through it from somewhere in the dark above the east balcony. The ballroom detonated into screaming. Dong-hyun had Mi-Yeon's arm in an iron grip before the second scream. His weapon was out. His eyes were fury. But Seokmin stood completely still in the chaos, looking at the destroyed chair. Then he looked at her. The noise of the room fell away. The screaming, the stampede of heels, the barked commands of his security team, all of it became distant and muffled because Ryu Seokmin was looking at Jang Mi-Yeon with an expression she couldn't name. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't warmth. It was the look of a man recalculating everything. "How?" he said. Not a question, an audit. Mi-Yeon's hands were shaking now that the adrenaline had somewhere to go. She pressed them flat against her thighs so he wouldn't see. "The wine glass," she said. "The reflection, the balcony angle. I've spent my whole life learning how to see what other people miss." Seokmin studied her for a long moment. Then, and this was the part that would keep her awake for weeks afterward, he almost smiled. "Dong-hyun," he said, without looking away from her face. "Boss," instantly at his shoulder. "She comes with us." Dong-hyun's grip on her arm tightened. She could be. She comes with us, the same tone, final as a door closing. To understand how we arrived here, at this woman in a jade hanbok, standing in the wreckage of the most dangerous night of her life, we need to go back. 4 hours earlier. Jang Mi-Yeon had arrived at the Busan Grand Sejong in a taxi that smelled like pine air freshener and old leather. Her costume bag balanced across her knees, her phone showing 17 unread messages from her younger sister about the academy's overdue bills. She'd read none of them. Tonight required everything she had. The hotel rose above the harbor like a monument to the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself, all dark glass and stone, understated in the way that only truly extravagant things could afford to be. The private gala inside was invitation only, and her invitation had come through an agency contact she'd never met in person, for a fee that would cover 2 months of the academy's debt if she performed flawlessly. Flawlessly. She had almost laughed at the word when she read the brief. She had been performing flawlessly her entire life. In recitals her mother cried at, in competitions where the judges marked her perfect 10s and then gave the trophy to someone with a more recognizable surname. In empty studios at midnight when no one was watching and the only audience was her own reflection in the practice mirror. Flawlessly and always overlooked. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her bag, and walked toward the entrance. She did not know, stepping through those doors, that she was about to perform the most important dance of her life. She did not know that the audience that mattered most would be one man with cold eyes and a target on his back. She did not know that before the night was over, she would stop being overlooked, permanently, and in ways she had never imagined, for better and for worse. She only knew that she needed to be flawless. And she was. The dressing room they gave her was barely larger than a supply closet. Mi-Yeon didn't complain. She had learned long ago that complaining was a luxury reserved for people whose absence would be noticed. She set her costume bag on the narrow bench, unzipped it with practiced care, and began the quiet ritual of becoming someone the stage could hold. First, the giagori, the upper jacket, deep jade silk with gold-threaded phoenixes climbing the sleeves. She had sewn 3 of those phoenixes herself, late at night at the academy work table after the last student had gone home, her needle moving in the same patient rhythm her mother had taught her. Up close, you could see where her thread tension had shifted, the small, honest imperfections of a woman who was tired but refused to stop. She had never performed anywhere this expensive. She told herself that didn't matter. It did, a little. Jang Academy of Traditional Arts was a grand name for a building that needed a new roof. It sat on a side street in Nampodong, sandwiched between a dry cleaner and a hardware store, in a neighborhood being slowly consumed by redevelopment. Mi-Yeon had grown up in the studio on the 2nd floor, had watched her mother teach there for 30 years, and had taken over the classes herself when her mother's knees gave out and her father's savings ran dry faster than anyone had planned. 11 students now. There had once been 38. The developers sent representatives in nice shoes who left glossy brochures about urban renewal and cultural integration. She put the brochures in the recycling bin and called her bank. The bank had been sympathetic in the specific, useless way that banks were sympathetic. Tonight's fee wouldn't save the academy, but it would buy her another month. Her mother had not spent 30 years building that studio for Mi-Yeon to be the one who lost it. She would not be the one who lost it. At 8:00 p.m., the traditional drums began, and Mi-Yeon walked into the light. This was the part she loved, the precise, clarifying instant when the performance began and everything that was not the performance ceased to exist. The bank, the brochures, the roof, all of it fell away. There was only the music, and the movement, and the space between them that her body existed to fill. She was 6 minutes in, past the first turn, into the rising passage where grief begins transforming into something harder to name, when she saw it. A small, rhythmic pulse of red, traveling across the crystal of a wine glass near the centerpiece at the head table. There and gone, there and gone. The kind of thing you miss if you spend your life looking at the center of things rather than the edges. She had spent her life looking at the edges. Laser sight, east balcony, targeting the head table. Her feet did not stop moving, but everything else inside her did. The room they put her in was cold in the deliberate way that certain men used cold, not as a matter of comfort, but as a statement of intent. No windows, a single overhead light, the kind that flattened everything beneath it. A metal chair that had been positioned in the exact center of the room, which Mi-Yeon understood was not accidental. She sat in it with her hands folded in her lap and her spine straight, because her mother had taught her that posture was the one thing you could control when everything else had been taken from you. Her jade hanbok was torn at the left sleeve. She hadn't noticed when it happened. Baek Dong-hyun stood across from her with his arms crossed and the particular stillness of a man who had done this many times and found it neither enjoyable nor unpleasant. Simply necessary. He was broad-shouldered and blunt-featured, somewhere in his mid-30s, with eyes that moved across her face in slow, methodical passes, reading her the way a customs officer reads a document, looking for the thing that doesn't belong. He hadn't asked her a question yet. She was beginning to understand the point. The silence stretched. Mi-Yeon had spent 15 years in rehearsal studios where silence was a working condition, where you sat with discomfort until your body learned to move through it rather than around it. She breathed slowly and did not fill the room with nervous words. Dong-hyun's eyes shifted almost imperceptibly. She had surprised him. Good. "How did you know about the laser?" he said finally. Not a question, an accusation wearing a question's shape. "I told him already. The wine glass, the reflection." "You're a dancer." "Yes. Dancers don't notice sniper sights." "This one does." She held his gaze. "I've spent my entire career learning to see what other people miss. That's not a threat, it's a skill. Tonight it happened to be useful." Something moved behind his eyes. Not belief, not yet, but the first hairline fracture of doubt in his certainty that she was the enemy. He opened his mouth. The door opened instead. The temperature in the room didn't drop. It was already cold, but something changed in the quality of the air, the way air changes before a storm makes landfall. Dong-hyun straightened almost imperceptibly. Mi-Yeon felt it before she saw it, the way you feel a stage go quiet before the lead performer enters. Ryu Seok-min stepped inside and closed the door behind him with the quiet, final sound of a decision being made. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. The overhead light made his face severe, all shadow and structure, nothing soft anywhere. Then he pulled a chair from the wall, turned it backward, and sat down facing her with his arms folded across the back. "Start from the beginning," he said, "and don't leave anything out." She told him everything. Not because she trusted him. She wasn't naive enough for that. Not in a room with no windows and a torn sleeve and Baek Dong-hyun breathing quietly by the door. She told him because the truth was the only currency she had, and spending it completely was safer than rationing it, and having him suspect she was holding something back. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Seok-min hadn't moved, hadn't interrupted, hadn't written anything down. He had simply watched her face with the focused, unblinking attention of a man who had built his entire survival on his ability to determine, in real time, whether a person was lying. "The spotter," he said. "Describe him." Mi-Yeon didn't hesitate. East balcony, second pillar from the left, dark jacket, not a suit, something more fitted. He wasn't a guest. He was standing at the wrong angle for someone enjoying the view. His eyes weren't on the performance. She paused. "They were on you." "Face." "Late 40s, heavy jaw, a scar here." She touched the outer corner of her own left eyebrow. "Small, old." Something happened in Seok-min's expression. Something she almost missed because it lasted less than a second, a tightening around the eyes, a stillness that was different from his usual stillness. Deeper. The stillness of a man absorbing a blow he hadn't let himself fully feel yet. Dong-hyun made a sound behind her, low, almost involuntary. "You know him," she said. It wasn't a question. Seok-min stood. He moved to the far wall and stood with his back to her for a moment, and she had the distinct sense that she was witnessing something private. a man rearranging the architecture of his understanding of his own world, quickly and without the luxury of visible distress. When he turned back, his face was composed again, but his eyes were different. Something in them had gone very, very cold. "The man you described," he said quietly, "has been with me for 11 years. The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. Mi-Yeon didn't speak. She understood instinctively that this was not a moment that wanted filling. Dong Hyun crossed to Seokmin and lowered his voice, but the room was small enough. "If it's him, then the access he has." "I know what access he has." Seokmin's voice was flat, final, the voice of someone closing a door on something that used to matter. He looked at Mi-Yeon then, and she understood, with the clarity of someone who had just realized how deep the water was beneath her, that she had not simply saved a man's life tonight. She had become the only living witness to a betrayal that someone powerful and desperate would now need to erase. "You can't go home," Seokmin said. It wasn't a suggestion. The safe house was not what she expected. She had constructed a picture in her mind during the drive, somewhere utilitarian and cold, bare walls and blacked-out windows, the functional ugliness of a place designed for hiding rather than living. What Dong Hyun's men brought her to instead was a narrow traditional hanok tucked into the hillside above Gamshin, its courtyard walls draped in old wisteria, the city falling away below it in layers of light and darkness like a painting done in a hurry. It was beautiful. That surprised her more than anything else about the night. She was given a room with a heated floor and a change of clothes, plain, well-made, clearly purchased by someone who had guessed her size correctly on the first attempt. She didn't ask how. She washed her face, changed, and sat on the edge of the bed listening to the house breathe around her. She didn't sleep. At some point past midnight, she followed the smell of coffee to the main room and found Seokmin standing at the open courtyard door, a cup in his hand, looking out at the city below. He didn't turn when she entered. "There's more on the counter." She poured a cup and stood at a careful distance, and for a while neither of them spoke. The city glittered below in silence. Somewhere down the hill, a dog barked once and went quiet. "You've stayed here before," she said eventually. It wasn't an accusation. The space had the particular quality of somewhere a person returned to small signs of occupancy that had nothing to do with tactical necessity. A book left spine up on the windowsill, a pair of worn slippers by the inner door. "When things get loud," he said, "I come here to think." She looked at him, really looked, the way she hadn't permitted herself to in the interrogation room. In the cold fluorescent light, he had been formidable, assembled, every edge intentional. Here, in the dark, with the wisteria moving slightly in the night air, he looked like something else. Not softer, exactly, but less performed. Tired, she thought. He looks tired in the way that has nothing to do with sleep. "Do you have family?" she asked. A pause. "A younger brother, we don't speak." He said it the way you state a fact about geography. "This river runs north. This road ends here." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It's safer for him." She understood what lived inside that sentence. The specific loneliness of a person who had made themselves dangerous so that everyone they loved could remain at a distance from the consequences. She knew a different version of that feeling. Smaller, quieter, but the same essential shape. "My mother doesn't know where I am tonight," she said. He looked at her then, really looked. "She will tomorrow," he said. "I'll make sure of it." She believed him. That frightened her more than anything else had. The call came at 4:17 a.m. Mi-Yeon was still awake. She had returned to her room, but not to sleep, sitting cross-legged on the heated floor with her back against the wall. Listening to the house and thinking about her mother's slippers by the studio door, and the way the second-floor window stuck in winter and needed lifting with both hands. Small things. The texture of a place she had spent her whole life inside. Her sister's name appeared on the screen, and she answered before the second ring. She heard the crying first. Then, behind it, something she identified a half-second later as the sound of water under pressure. A fire hose, she realized. The sound of a fire hose meant the fire was already far enough along to require one. Mi-Yeon. Her sister's voice was the particular broken open sound of someone delivering news they cannot believe they are delivering. The academy. Someone, they said it's. She was already moving. Seokmin was in the courtyard when she came through the main room, phone to his ear, his expression telling her that he already knew. His eyes found hers across the dark space, and something passed between them, not words, not comfort, just acknowledgement. The clean, terrible acknowledgement of a thing that could not be undone. "Don't," he said quietly before she could speak. "My mother built that." "I know." His voice was low and very even, the way very still water is even. "My car is already outside." She understood then that he had not been sleeping either. They kept her across the street. Dong Hyeon's hand on her arm, not roughly, just firmly, the way you hold someone back from a ledge. She stood on the wet pavement in borrowed clothes and watched 30 years reduce themselves to smoke and orange light, and the exhausted movements of firefighters working a battle they had arrived too late to win. The roof she had been trying to save had fallen in already. Her sister was beside her, her face ash-pale and wet, and Mi-Yeon put her arm around her and said nothing because there was nothing that functioned as language yet. Sometimes grief needed a few minutes before it would accept words. She did not cry. She wasn't sure why. Perhaps because somewhere beneath the grief was a cold, clarifying anger that was taking up all the available space. She turned once to look for Seokmin. He was standing apart from the small crowd, phone at his side now, watching the building burn with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the cold assessment of the interrogation room, not the tired honesty of the courtyard at midnight. This was rage in its most controlled, and therefore most dangerous form. Utterly still, utterly quiet. The rage of a man converting grief directly into resolve without stopping anywhere in between. He felt her looking, met her eyes. "They wanted you to see this," he said. "They wanted you afraid." She turned back to the fire. "Tell me what to do," she said. The rain started an hour before they found the spotter. Not the soft, hesitant rain of early autumn, but the hard, committed kind that turned Busan's streets into mirrors and reduced visibility to the distance between one streetlight and the next. Mi-Yeon watched it through the window of Seokmin's car and thought about how her mother always said rain before dawn meant the day had something to prove. Dong Hyeon got the location at 5:40 a.m., a name to go with the scarred face, Lim Cheol-soo, 11 years in the syndicate's inner logistics, currently occupying a serviced apartment in Hyundai under a name that almost but didn't quite match his own. The kind of mistake a careful man makes when he is suddenly in a hurry. Seokmin was in the front seat. He didn't look at the address when Dong Hyeon passed it forward. He simply said, "Drive," in the voice that meant the conversation about whether to go had already happened and ended. They were 6 minutes out when Cheol-soo ran. Dong Hyeon's phone lit up, a contact near the building, positioned without Mi-Yeon's knowledge, apparently without sleep. The target was moving. On foot, heading toward the Hyundai Beach Road, which meant he either had a vehicle waiting or he was panicking, and panicking men chose open space instinctively, the illusion of options. "He knows we're coming," Dong Hyeon said. "Then we stop being careful," Seokmin said. The driver found another register entirely. The car pressed itself into the wet road, and the city blurred, neon bleeding sideways through the rain-streaked windows, red and blue and the cold white of convenience store fronts strobing past in a continuous, disorienting rush. Mi-Yeon braced her hand against the door and said nothing. The speed felt less like movement and more like the world being peeled back to reveal something underneath. They cut through a night market's empty aftermath, stalls folded and dark, and swung onto the coastal road with the sea appearing suddenly on the left. Black and enormous and indifferent, the waves catching the city's light and throwing it back in broken pieces. Headlights ahead, a car pulling fast from a side street, fishtailing on the wet road before finding its grip. "That's him," Dong Hyeon said. What followed was not elegant. It was not the choreographed precision of the action films Mi-Yeon had watched as a teenager. It was 2 cars on a rain-slicked road at a speed that made every decision irreversible, the gap between them closing and opening and closing again, as Cheol-soo's driver took risks that suggested someone had told him what happened to people Seok-min caught. They were right to be afraid. The gap closed for the final time at the road's long curve above Dalmaji Hill. Cheol-soo's car drifted wide on the wet surface, and Seok-min's driver took the inside clean. The chase ended against a guardrail, with a sound like a door slamming shut on everything that came before. Seok-min stepped out into the rain without hurrying. "Stay in the car," he said to Mi-Yeon, and his voice had returned to that flat, final register that meant the next few minutes were not for her to witness. She stayed. She looked out at the Black Sea and listened to the rain, and understood that the world she had stepped into the moment she grabbed his sleeve was larger and darker than she had let herself fully accept until now. The door opened 4 minutes later. Seok-min got in. His jacket was wet. His expression gave nothing. "We have a name," he said. "The traitor." The driver pulled back onto the road. Below them, the sea continued its indifferent work against the shore. The invitation had gone out under Seok-min's seal that same afternoon. A private gathering, masked, the Joseon-era villa in Dongnigu that the syndicate used for occasions requiring a certain remove from ordinary venues, high walls, controlled access, the kind of place where the architecture itself suggested that what happened inside stayed inside. The guest list was the inner circle, complete and unedited. Seok-min had been precise about that. Everyone attended. Absences would be noted. Mi-Yeon had one task. The name Cheol-soo had given them in the rain above Dalmaji Hill was a name she recognized, not from the world she had stumbled into, but from the gala. A face she had catalogued in those careful minutes of observation from the backstage wing, before the drums began and before everything changed. She had seen him move through the ballroom with the particular confidence of someone who knew exactly where all the exits were. She needed to confirm it, visually, unambiguously, because Seok-min had told her, with a quietness that made the words heavier rather than lighter, that he would not act on a single source. Not for this. Not against someone this close. He needed her eyes one more time. They fitted her in a gown the color of deep water, a mask of lacquered white with gold at the edges. She stood before the mirror in the Hanbok and barely recognized herself, which felt appropriate. The woman who had arrived at the Busan Grand Sejong with a costume bag and 17 unread messages was not quite the same woman looking back at her now. She wasn't sure yet whether that was a loss. The villa was candlelit and full of masks, animals, spirits, abstract geometries of silk and painted wood. The traditional ensemble played in the far corner, the music slow and formal and laced with an undercurrent of tension that Mi-Yeon suspected only she could hear. Or perhaps everyone could hear it and simply had the discipline not to show it. These were, after all, people who had built careers on not showing things. She moved through the room the way she moved through a performance, present in her body, reading the space, her attention distributed evenly across everything so that nothing could surprise her from the edges. Seok-min was somewhere in the room. She didn't look for him. They had agreed. She found the traitor in the third pass. He was wearing a tiger mask and standing near the inner courtyard door with a cup he wasn't drinking from. And the thing that confirmed it, the thing that her 15 years of trained observation delivered to her with quiet certainty, was not his face or his build or the scar she couldn't see beneath the mask. It was his hands. The way he held them, the specific, habitual positioning of a man managing his own anxiety with the practiced discipline of someone who had been managing it for a very long time. She had seen those hands at the head table. She had seen them still when everything else in the room was moving. She crossed the room to the small orchestra and requested, quietly, a change of music. The ensemble shifted into Chinyangjo, the slowest, most deliberate movement in the traditional repertoire, a piece that required the room to slow with it. It was the signal they had agreed on. Across the candlelit space, she saw Seok-min turn. The traitor's name was Park Sung-jin. Seok-min said at once, quietly, to Dong Hyun in the villa's inner courtyard, while the music continued inside, and the masked guests moved through their careful, unknowing choreography. Mi-Yeon stood at the courtyard's edge and heard it and watched something in Dong Hyun's face, a man not given to visible reaction, move briefly toward grief before reassembling itself into something harder. Sungjin had been with them 14 years, 2 years longer than Cheol-soo, long enough to know everything. She expected what came next to be violent. She had braced herself for it somewhere during the drive to the villa, had constructed a quiet internal wall between what she might witness and what she would allow herself to feel about it. This world operated on different mathematics than hers. She understood that now without flinching from it. What happened instead surprised her. Seok-min made 3 phone calls from the courtyard. His voice throughout was the same measured, unhurried register he used for everything: the interrogation, the safe house, the rain above Dalmaji Hill. Unhurried men, she was learning, were the most dangerous kind, because they had already calculated far enough ahead that the present moment held no urgency. The first call lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, he told her, without being asked, that it had been to a financial regulator, a contact, long cultivated, who would find by morning that Park Sungjin's secondary accounts contained irregularities substantial enough to require immediate freezing and investigation. The second call was to a journalist. She didn't ask which one. The third was shorter, 2 sentences. She didn't hear it clearly and didn't try. "That's everything?" she asked when he put the phone away. "That's everything." She looked at him. "You could have." "Yes," he didn't let her finish. "I could have." The music drifted through from inside. Someone laughed at something, bright and unknowing. "Your name is attached to this now," he said. "Whatever happens next, however this resolves, your name will be in rooms it was never in before. I won't have it attached to the other way of doing things." She understood what the sentence had cost him. Not the decision itself. She suspected he had made it before they arrived, perhaps before they left the Hanbok, perhaps somewhere on the rain-slicked road above the sea while she had been looking at the waves, and he had been looking at whatever came next. The cost was in saying it aloud, in allowing her to know that she had changed the calculation. Men like Ryu Seok-min did not typically explain themselves. Inside, the Chinyangjo reached its final passage, that long, unhurried resolution where the music seemed to accept something it had been resisting and finally, with great patience, let it go. Park Sungjin would be in custody before sunrise. Seok-min looked at her across the dark courtyard. "It's almost over," he said. She thought about the academy roof, open to the sky now, and her mother's 30 years of work in a pile of ash on a Nam-Podong side street. "Not quite," she said. 1 year later, the new academy opened on a Tuesday. Not in Nam-Podong. That chapter had closed with the ash and the rain and a side street that developers had already moved into with the speed of people who had been waiting. The new building stood in Yongsan, Seoul, 4 floors of pale stone and wide windows that let the afternoon light fall across the studio floors in long, clean angles. The kind of light that made dancers look like they were already performing even when they were simply warming up. Her mother had cried at the door. Mi-Yeon had held her and said nothing and looked over her shoulder at the building and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. She didn't ask where the funding had come from. She understood the shape of it. The invitation to perform at the Seoul Arts Center had arrived in February, a gala celebrating the centenary of Korean traditional dance as a recognized national art form. The kind of stage Mi-Yeon had spent 15 years being adjacent to without ever being placed on. The program listed her name at the top, which she read 3 times before she believed it. She prepared for 6 weeks. Alone, mostly, in the new studio after the last student left, the city quiet outside the wide windows and her reflection keeping her honest in the mirror. The piece she chose was Salpuri, the same choreography she had been performing the night everything changed. It seemed right. It seemed like the only honest choice. The Seoul Art Center's main stage held 2,000 seats. Every one of them was filled. She didn't look for him until after the final movement. The performance had gone the way the best performances went, not perfectly, because perfection was a closed door, but truly, which was a different and better thing. She had danced the grief and the transformation and the release with the full weight of the past year behind her, and the audience had felt it. She could tell in the quality of their silence. When the applause came, it rose like weather. She looked up then, to the VIP level, second box from the left. He was there. Dark suit, no security visible, though she knew better. The expression on his face was not the cold assessment of the interrogation room or the tired honesty of the Hanbok courtyard at midnight. It was something quieter than either of those things. A man watching something he had played a small part in making possible, without needing anyone in the room to know it. He didn't applaud. He simply watched her, and when her eyes found his across the full, luminous distance of the hall, something passed between them that had no name yet but was patient enough to wait for one. She held his gaze for one breath. Then she bowed to the audience, and the lights came down warm and gold around her, and the applause continued, and the city outside went on in its ordinary, extraordinary way. Some stories don't end. They simply find, after everything, the right place to begin.